There we go. Now we can start class. Okay. So yeah. So this week we're going to introduce you very directly to Dr. Keltner. So I have a fairly long discussion that he did with Michael Polin, that I thought was a really good introduction. It's a little long, so it might be that we have to finish that next week, and then the week after that, I'm going to try and do something that's a little more kind of technically scientific stuff, like what's going on in the brain. But to start off, there were a couple of things I wanted to just point out from his book. So the first being, he defines awe as a very basic definition. Awe is the feeling of being in the presence of something vast that transcends your current understanding of the world. And I kind of wonder, okay, so what do we do with the big building? And I wonder if it might be that it's an ordinary object, but most of us really have no idea how you go about building something like that. So there is a sense, it seems to me, in which something like that does transcend our understanding of the world, even though it's an ordinary object, simply because it's beyond us to try to recreate it. We have no idea, the people who did it, we don't know how they did it. And even though it's old, we still don't have any idea, because we're not construction workers. So it might be that if you're in the business of doing that, if you're an architect or an engineer who works with those buildings, that it may be that you understand it too well, and so you wouldn't have that kind of experience. But for lay people, we can still have that, because it's still a kind of mystery. I mean, not vast a mystery. There's a storm, maybe.
It might depend on where you grew up too, because if you grow up on a Nebraska farm and suddenly find yourself on Fifth Avenue and 34th Street in Manhattan, the Empire State Building would be pretty awesome.
Oh, okay, that's a good point. Yeah. What is your prior experience? Yeah. Okay, so, and then let's see. He has this interesting sort of idea here. I'm going to call them flavors in a second. This is the bit. In awe, we encounter the vast mysteries of life with flavoring themes like conceptions of virtue, supernatural beliefs, and perceived threat, giving rise to near infinite variations. So,
he doesn't mention the concept of connection that I think we talked about.
Yeah. So, and I think that's the difference between spirituality and awe. Connection. But what's interesting here is this idea. I think this idea about flavoring. So, depending on, and I think this would be about experience. Your worldview that you're bringing to the experience. And so, depending on how you've been culturally trained, you might appreciate some things more than others. And so he does mention that they did a comparative study with college students in Beijing and probably at UCLA. Forget where exactly it was, but it was somewhere in the US. And what he found was the Chinese students were much more responsive to stories of moral virtue. They would be awe-filled by stories of moral virtue. The US students responded more predictably to natural beauty. And you're like, well, okay, why would that be? Well, different cultures. That's that Confucian culture in China has primed them, I think, to be more focused on something like moral virtue. Okay, so no. I had a list of these feelings. Oh, okay, here we go. Okay, so these eight flavorings that he mentions. So moral beauty, like personal courage and exceptional virtue. Collective effervescence, which is a term he gets from the French sociologist Émile Durkheim, and he's thinking about things that we do in big groups, celebrations like weddings, quinceañera, family reunions, political rallies. So big those can also be spiritual experiences in my definition, because that's the kind of thing you can feel connected to as well as just being sort of awe inspired by it, collective effervescence. Third was nature. Fourth is music. Let's see. So fifth would be visual design. So things like the paintings that we saw last week. Sixth, spiritual and religious awe, which he means in a sort of very traditional kind of sense of what people would think of as religious awe. Trying to experience nirvana, satori bliss, those kind of concepts. Stories of life and death. And then epiphanies, which I think is kind of an interesting, I'm not sure entirely what to do with that one, but he references sort of like Darwin, and there's stories about when Darwin, it kind of hit him that this idea that, oh, everything's changing, and that epiphany is an awe-inspiring kind of thing. So those may be harder to achieve and not as easy to just cultivate as some of the others, like standing in front of a big building.
Well, maybe,
Mhm.
Sorry, Richard, maybe not to cultivate, but epiphanies can be as simple as thinking one way, and all of a sudden, your thoughts have changed because you came across something, and you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I was thinking this way before.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think that, yeah, I mean, yeah, they might be very ordinary in terms of the details, but then extraordinary because of the
Exactly.
comparison you were making, the realization you had. Yeah. Okay. So then I think I just wanted to get you started with some of those ideas. So I want to show you this video, and because it's a little long, I especially want to emphasize that it's okay to interrupt. That's the whole point of having class, is to talk about these things. So yeah, so anytime they say something, you have a question, you have a comment, feel free to just interrupt, and I'll stop the video and we can talk for a while about that and then go on. So that's what I really want you to feel comfortable doing that. Okay, here we go. Something to run. So let's see, I'm starting in. They've had this is like 7 minutes into the video, getting through some introduction. So this is where the interesting stuff starts.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. What a nice big crowd. It's a privilege to be here celebrating my friend and colleague's wonderful new book. You're in for a treat if you haven't read it yet. It's just such an unusual combination of scientific research, reporting over a great range, from San Quentin to the wilds of the Sierra to, I mean, it takes you many places. It's really an achievement. So I'm delighted to be here in conversation with Dacher. Dacher, I'm going to start by asking you to kind of psychoanalyze me a little bit. I love doing that. So last week I was in Iceland. Judith and I, my wife and I, were in Iceland. And I had 2 awe experiences, at least 2 awe. I probably had 3 or 4, but there are 2 I want to talk about because they're really different, and I'd like to get your take on them. So the second night in Iceland, we were in Reykjavik, and we're in the bar, and suddenly someone screams out, "Northern Lights," which I see is like the cover of this book. And everybody runs outside without paying their bills, and the bartender chases after us. "You must settle up first." And Judith and I headed down to the water where there was the least amount of light pollution, and looked up and saw the most awesome sight that I think I've seen, which was these swirls of dancing greenery over the water. And it really does, it feels transformative. It just takes you out of yourself. And I was literally awestruck. It was a 10 on the awe meter. And I felt like I was in the presence of something big and mysterious. Then 2 days later, a completely different kind of experience. We went to a Pussy Riot concert. The Pussy Riot.
I hope you can make sense of this. So yeah.
They've ended up in Iceland, or they're in Iceland for a while. They've escaped Russia. One of them actually is still in jail, I think. And it was a benefit for Ukraine.
Yeah.
And they were incredible, actually. I mean, it's not my kind of music. It was kind of an assault. But the moral clarity, I mean, and the fierceness of these women and their courage. I mean, they have been arrested time after time after time. And this was another kind of awe.
Yeah.
So
Moral courage.
Same, two very different events,
Yeah.
similar emotion.
Yeah.
So what was going on?
Yeah. It's one of the magical properties of this incredible emotion that Einstein thought was maybe our most fundamental emotion, that other people have talked about as a basic state of consciousness. That awe comes from many different sources. We can talk about our work in 26 different countries that really identify what we call 8 wonders that give rise to awe. And your 2 examples fit nicely into 2 of them.
So which 2 are they?
Nature, and just our marveling at the sky and the mysteries of the sky, which have been a source of cosmology and religion and philosophical insight for millennia. And then cultural expression through music, right? And what they have in common, I think, is the fundamental property of awe, and in some sense, in need of today, which is to kind of relate the self and our way of being in the world to things that are larger than the self. Cultural ideas expressed, Pussy Riot's music, the nature of light in the sky. And so that would be my psychoanalysis of your 2 experiences of awe.
It's interesting. I would have put the Pussy Riot concert, because I didn't especially like the music, in another category you talked about, which is moral beauty.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what that is?
Yeah, this was, there are all kinds of misconceptions about awe, and in part that's why we do scholarship. People tend to think of it as an emotion that's primarily about nature, which is true. And there's a great nature tradition in awe. It's a spiritual emotion, but in our study of 26 different countries, where we really gathered stories of awe from countries as different as Mexico and India and China and Japan, really gathering these rich narratives about this experience. And the most common source of awe is moral beauty, is where you are struck, moved to tears, you get goosebumps. Even talking about it can bring on these emotions, about kindness.
Okay, so there I want to pause for a second. I'd forgotten that he had said that. The most common, in terms of what they're finding when they're trying to study it. That's a really interesting feature. And he has other videos where he likes to talk about the power of compassion and how compassion relates to our being social creatures. And so I guess that makes sense. You put those 2 things together, that what is going to help people be more social? Well, if one of the things they're experiencing awe about, especially, is going to be noticing when other people are doing something that's especially praiseworthy, and they go, wow. So yeah, that seems really interesting to me, really important sociologically.
Stories of people sharing clothing and food and so forth. Courage. One of my favorite stories was from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1973. A son went into a bar with an African-American friend, 1973. Some customer used the N-word, and the son's dad, who was the bartender, threw the guy out of the bar, right? And just had this courage to confront racism at the time. Special talents, overcoming obstacles. So it's striking to me that this mysterious emotion its deepest provenance is the goodness of other people, right? And that tells us something fundamental about how we build moral communities, that we have these moral, inspiring responses to these kinds of moral beauty. Pussy Riot would be a good example, you know, fighting for justice and
putting themselves at such risk.
Yeah.
Courage. Yeah.
I heard a story just a couple days ago about a professional wrestler who was like the first generation of that kind of a thing in the late 1950s and into the 60s. And this guy called himself Sputnik Monroe, which that's kind of interesting. Okay, Sputnik. So that reference to the Soviet Union. But he was apparently a real motive force in getting professional wrestling kind of established as an entertainment form. But what was most astounding about him is that he was most famous for hanging out in bars for Black people, because he's doing this at a time there's still Jim Crow segregation, hangs out in Black bars and gives out tickets to people to come see his shows for free. And the cops keep arresting him because he's not allowed to be there as a white man. But he was just personally conducting his own civil rights struggle all by himself. And he's such a big, he was a big guy too, that fits for the professional wrestling thing. But it's just amazing. And the last time he got arrested doing this, he actually hired a Black attorney to defend him. And this is like in Memphis or someplace. And that just caused all kinds of turmoil in the courtroom that he would do that. But I think the lawyer actually got him off. Probably because he's a white man, so this is white privilege there. But amazing moral courage, and a guy I'd never heard of before, Sputnik Monroe.
Courage is so maybe before we go any further, you should offer us a definition of awe.
Yeah, it's one of these ironies where the people really have hesitated, and I think that's why the science of awe is really recent. How dare you define awe? If you define it, you lose its mystery. And that's despite the fact that people have been writing about awe for millennia, often pathologically so, nature awe, spiritual awe, psychedelic awe, etc. And so science begins with definitions. And we, Jonathan Haidt and I, in 2003, consulted a lot of the spiritual traditions.
Yeah, when he's saying spiritual awe, personally, I think the better language would be religious awe, that he's meaning something that's associated with a religious tradition. But since I think spirituality is this other thing that includes connection, he's confusing the terms, in my philosophical opinion. So I would steer it in that direction. He means religious awe.
Traditions writing about awe, the transcendent experiences in the Upanishads, the great writings in that tradition, and in particular the philosophical traditions of Edmund Burke, this Irish philosopher, who said that awe, what he called the sublime, is about power or vastness and obscurity. The mind can't make out what you're seeing. And so we defined awe in slightly more contemporary terms as vast things. And I know there's going to be a hand out there like, what about the small things that give you awe, like looking into a microscope? Fair enough. There are always counterexamples. So it's vast and it's mysterious. You just can't make sense of it with your current knowledge.
And even the microscopic, though, that to me does make intuitive sense, because what you're looking into is a world that is much more vast than you realized. So there is actually vastness in it.
I think vast mystery gets us close.
So vastness, define vastness, if you would.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, we all know what it means, but where's the vastness in the courage of Pussy Riot? Where's how does vastness figure in moral beauty?
Yeah, so I think the latest thinking is our minds move through the day sort of calculating regularities in the world, and we have this frame of reference of what we expect to see based on those computations, if you will. And then vastness exceeds that frame of reference, right? And so we have ideas about the courage that it would take to stand up to injustice. And then when you hear about a musician that's willing to go to prison, that's of a different scale. right? And so it's big. And
so it's a scale question,
yeah,
really. And it's this idea that your usual way of proceeding that just doesn't work, right? It's short-circuited.
Yeah, and there are, you know, and this brings in all kinds of absurd examples of awe. Like how many of you have stood next to a person who's 7 feet tall? You're just like, I can't talk. You're giant, you know. And
I get that sometimes. I'm 6'4".
It's their ordinary experience, and that's when awe begins.
Yeah. It's a universal emotion, you say.
Yeah.
And that struck me. I never thought of awe as an emotion, actually, until I started talking to you about it. It seemed like an experience, not an emotion. But it's universal, yet it's harder to explain than other emotions that are so clearly adaptive and contribute to our survival and success, like fear or disgust. So what good is it? What's it good for? Why has it been preserved in evolution, would you say?
Yes, that's the journalist question. What good is awe? You know, like, I don't know, man. It's you do know. It's good to study. Yeah, it's a big question. And as we started to do the science of awe about 15 years ago, there was really a deep shift in evolutionary thinking about the human species, kind of culminating E.O. Wilson, The Social Conquest of the Earth, or whatever the title was, meaning we are a hyper social species. We are the most social mammal that's ever existed, the most social species. We synchronize with others, we mimic others, we know others, other people's minds. Big chunks of the brain are devoted to that. And we promoted this at the greater good, which is every survival relevant task in our hominid evolution, we accomplished socially. We raised offspring in networks of people providing care. We defended ourselves. We faced food scarcity, which was a fundamental shaper of human evolution and food and preferences socially. We even dealt
You're talking about through hunting and then agriculture.
Right,
yeah.
You know, and even with cold. We're a particular kind of social mammal that huddles when it gets really cold, right? And we share warmth. It's just built into us. And what that means is, in the context of our evolution, we needed a variety of adaptations that help us be members of communities, to help us share, to sacrifice. And awe has all those features, right? It's so fascinating, you know, when you experience the Northern Lights in Iceland, there's probably part of your mind that was saying, I see a pattern in the sky, but I'm actually part of a community. These people around me, I care for more. That doesn't make sense in some sense semantically, because it's a pattern in nature triggering a belief about your social world. But that's a regularity of awe. So awe.
But there was a desire to share the experience, and there was a whole lot of chatter about it.
Right.
And afterwards.
Yeah. And so awe.
You all felt privileged that we'd had this opportunity.
And you probably were proposing camping trips and, you know, creating a political party around Michael Polin, and, you know, so yeah, it's just this collective emotion that helps us do the things we need to do as a collective species.
So it's pro-social, even when it's an individual experience.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, we have funny studies of that. You take students to the Berkeley eucalyptus trees, they look up into the trees for a minute, and then another part of an experimenter walks by and stumbles and drops all these pens. And when you look up at the trees, you're like, I'll help that guy, you know, and there you go.
I love that experiment.
I know.
You told me about that.
Yeah,
so
it makes you generous, and profoundly so.
And you suggested also, though, is an antidote for narcissism and egotism. How does that work? Why should that kind of experience, and how did you prove that?
Yeah, so, you know, one of the really fascinating things in doing this book is, you know, it's humbling to study awe with science, and you're like, you know, like, how much awe did you feel, Michael? Is that a 7 or an 8? And you're like, yeah. So I read a lot of awe writing, and there are spectacular traditions of awe writing. The spiritual journaling and writing, Julian of Norwich, right? And writing about a relationship to Jesus. One of the first books written by a woman in English, she uses the phrase, I am nothing. I think 14 times. It comes out of our experiences of awe. Emerson, in one of his famous quotes, all mean egotism vanishes. I even quote Michael in one of his psychedelic experiences. I can't remember what it was, DMT or
it was psilocybin. Yeah.
Well, were you the Post-it notes?
Yeah,
Michael's like, myself is like a bunch of Post-it notes, and they all vanish when I'm feeling psychedelic awe. And that's a fascinating part of this experience, is the dissolving of the self. And so we did a bunch of crazy studies to,
So there's a technical term in here we'll use over and over: default mode network. That's the sort of what the psychologists call the machinery that is constructing that self. Default mode network.
To be part of this conversation about ego dissolution. One of my favorites is we stopped, we got it, there's a highway that goes into Yosemite Valley, and at the first lookout, we positioned a bunch of researchers led by Yang Bai from China, and like people like, whoa, hold on a second, fill out a questionnaire. And as part of the questionnaire, we were like, this is sophisticated science, draw yourself. So in the awe condition, they drew tiny little selves, right? Compared to another one. I have to tell you, my other favorite one is we did this awe walk study where once a week we got people who are 75 years old or older to do an awe walk, to go find awe wherever they walk. And while they were doing it, we had them take a selfie. And in the awe condition, the self starts to get smaller and it starts to fade out of the picture, right? They can't, they're off the picture. So the sense of self dissolves with awe, and in the brain as well with the default mode network. That's big news, because a lot of people...
You have to back up a little. So, I mean, what's the default mode network? And I was going to ask you, what's going on in the brain? What do we know during an awe experience?
Yeah, we often we can rely on neuroscience when our measures may cause a little bit of doubt, right? If it can really register in neurophysiological patterns, that's another kind of evidence to speak to a claim. And the default mode network is this fascinating couple of chunks in your brain, massive chunks in the front and the side, the posterior cingulate cortex. And they really those chunks seem to be involved in the self, right? Self-representation, staying on task, keeping track of my status and the like. And different kinds of awe quiet down the default mode network, right? Musical awe, nature awe, psychedelics.
Yeah. That was one of the findings.
So that's really interesting. It starts to converge with the impressionistic reports of like, God, when I feel awe, I just disappear. I feel like I'm nothing, like Julian of Norwich. And here we're seeing it in the brain as well. And what I really find encouraging is, especially for young people, is a shift away from the self, right? It's a narcissistic era with selfies and so forth. And here's an emotion for a minute or two where you can kind of quiet that chatter, which is good news.
Really good news, and politically relevant too,
yeah.
Right? I mean, given the rampant egotism and narcissism in our society. So you've been on this beat, as we would say in journalism, for 20 years. When did you write that piece with John Haidt?
I think it was 2003.
So
yeah.
Why awe? How did you, I'm kind of curious to know your kind of intellectual biography that took you to awe, and what were some of the big aha moments?
Yeah,
since you started working on it.
Yeah, thank you. Sometimes when you write a book, I am a scientist, so I write about the science. And I was humbled writing this book because I think you need other kinds of scholarship, which William James wrote about stories, and I interviewed a lot of people. And then, some books get really personal. And in writing this book, realized I was kind of raised as a wild child. I was raised in a context of awe. My mom taught literature and romanticism and Shelley and Virginia Woolf and Wordsworth, who figures prominently in this book, and was just filling our house with that. And my dad was a painter, still is. Loved Goya, who was right on that border of horror and awe. And Francis Bacon and his fleshy paintings. You know, he painted us all the time. I grew up in Laurel Canyon in the late 60s. I was kind of meant to study awe, and I had to come to Berkeley to do it, because then I could say, come on, man, I'm at Berkeley, I get to study awe, so that was part of it. And part of it was just the mystery of it, like if we have the tools of science, of the brain and measurement and the voice and how it affects our sense of self, can we get close to really one of the great mysteries about human beings is this capacity. What are the big aha moments? One is Jane Goodall, who observed awe in chimpanzees. I write about it. And she said, I think this is primate awe and the beginning of mammalian spirituality. And I agree. I think.
Yeah, I don't think he tells the rest of the story, but Goodall, she's hanging out with these chimps in Tanzania, and there's a spot that she discovers that has this really pretty waterfall, and she notices that the chimps will go and just sit there and just look at the waterfall. Like, well, and she describes it this way: this is chimpanzee awe, and and people really resisted it because you're just anthropomorphizing the chimps. But from an evolutionary perspective, it just makes perfect sense. Well, we didn't invent this, it came along with hominid evolution. So the fact that the chimps will sit and just stare at the waterfall, we do that. Just stare at the waterfall, filled with awe.
Didn't she also report that they had their hair was standing on end? There were physiological reactions as they were watching the waterfall.
Oh, I didn't remember that detail.
So you can't just say, oh, maybe this was just he had indigestion or something, but it was a definite reaction to, and some movements or vocalizations that went along with it. I thought it was very fascinating.
Yeah. Oh, and he does. I don't know if we'll have how much we'll get to this, but he does mention that that's the physiological root of what we call goosebumps.
Yeah.
That it's the animal is trying to make the hairs stand upright, and that's what your skin is doing when it does that. It's like, oh, far out. It's all connected.
Richard, my grandnephew, it's a memorable experience. He was, I don't think he was a year old yet, but he just stood and put his hand under running water and just stared. I mean, just was mesmerized by that in less than a year old. And yeah.
Well, there is a thought that babies are having a kind of psychedelic experience most of the time because their senses are all overwhelmed with what's coming in. And so
that's true.
Yeah, I have done the same thing myself on mushrooms, just feeling water running out of a faucet, and it just can be the most amazing thing. That's so cool. You figured that out 1 year old. Wow.
Yeah. I'll have to tell him that.
Yeah, something else worth mentioning is his book is framed a lot on his experience watching his brother die.
Yes.
That's a big part, yeah.
His beloved younger brother, who was almost part of him. They did everything together. And he describes that experience as an awe experience, being close to him. And it comes up again and again in the book. So it's, I'm not sure if he's going to mention it in this interview or not. He might be leading up to it.
I think, it's been a while since I screened this, so I don't really remember either. I think it'll come up. Yeah, he dedicated the book to his brother.
Right.
Actually, on the subject of the book, I just noticing for class, it says on mine. Can you all read that? Maybe I can't get it focused, but it says for sale in the Indian subcontinent only. How did I end up with this book that's only for sale on the Indian subcontinent? that made me feel a little bit of awe. You know, just suddenly the world was a lot bigger. I have a book from Pakistan.
Oh, that's interesting.
And I know, and you know, the cover is very different from the one they have. So yeah, it's a different printing of it.
Mm.
And she was writing about the goosebumps, piloerection, very old mammalian
So
response.
she could see that in her
Aha.
tent.
Oh,
Yeah,
she did mention that. Yeah.
Waterfalls, large storms. Franz de Waal has later observed, the great primatologist, you see this fluffing up of the fur and almost reverential behavior when friends, chimpanzee friends pass by and they merge together, right? So it's this merging of self with others. So
you think it's pro-social among chimps too?
Franz de Waal is the director of the Yerkes Primate Institute in Atlanta, and is one of the world's foremost authorities on comparing primates and humans behaviorally. Does some really interesting experiments in the institute.
yeah, I think it's this transcendent, this structure to awe that begins in primates that's about, I'm way more than this separate self. I'm way more than my unique desires. I'm merging with others around me for evolutionary benefit. I think that's a big aha moment. The moral beauty really struck me, that, and also moral beauty, the idea that what we revere most is just ordinary kindness and courage that's all around us. And that struck me, that we've got to open our eyes to that. And the third is really striking, is we did this method. There are different ways that you capture experience. It's very hard in science. I'm not sure you ever can, but we try. And one method is called the daily diary experience. And you get people at the end of the day to report on whether they had an experience or not. And we did this study in Japan, China, Barcelona, the United States, with different collaborators. Did you have an experience of awe, right? We did it for 2 weeks. And when we analyzed the data, people are experiencing awe 2 to 3 times a week, right? So it's this everyday experience. You know, Descartes felt that it was just a basic state of consciousness is awe. And I think there's something to that it's there if we can clear away stuff to feel.
I think there's more or less awe around today. I mean, if you did that historically, right, and you had done those diaries 20 years ago, we going, you know, where's this market in awe?
Yeah, you know, or 500 years ago, right, in the Renaissance era, or
yeah,
you know, and you know, I think in some ways, it's the best of times for awe. One of the heroes of the book is William James, who in writing about mystical awe says it can come from anywhere. And I think in our survey data, people find awe from everything, you know, the mechanics of a watch, you know, my uncle's jokes that he tells, you know, the trees outside the redwood trees. So in some sense, we're free to feel awe.
But we're also spending more time on phones and
Right.
screens, which seem to me,
Yeah,
you know, diminishing our opportunities. You know, we don't look around when we're
Yeah.
waiting online.
Yeah, I agree.
We look at our phones.
And I think the
our phone, I mean, can you have awe on a phone?
depends whose phone. Yeah, I think technology has a lot to offer for, you know, in our survey of 26 different countries, no one mentioned Facebook as a source of awe. No one mentioned a Google search or Google Maps. No one mentioned virtual reality. So I think technology gets in the way of awe. And then I think that what technology and more broadly, the cultural conditions of today of task-focused, hyper-competitive, working harder, we've lost a lot of wandering in our lives that we need for awe to think of. So I think it's complicated. I think we have the capacity to feel more awe probably less than 30 or 40 years ago.
I heard this amazing statistic some time back that the National Park Service in Canada had figured out from collecting data that 100 years ago, the average trip that someone would take through the Canadian kind of wetlands in the middle of the country, go on a little canoe trip. The average length of that trip 100 years ago was 3 weeks. The average length of that trip today is 3 days. And yeah, and that's just people they work, everybody's working so much more. And that's just shocking to me. 3 weeks to 3 days.
Richard, I would say about technology that there are cases where I've seen videos or pictures that really took me aback.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Yeah, that we do have access to that. That you could see a photo of something that, yeah, in any one of those flavors maybe is eliciting it.
May I say something too? I was really thinking that the question of is there more or less awe now than in former times, I think is a very interesting one, because I think he mentions in his book, there's also kind of a stereotype of awe sometimes that people think, oh, well, this was people who were, uninformed in earlier times. You see certain phenomena in the sky and you have a certain explanation for that, or you don't have an explanation for that. And now, there's more science out. And some people would feel that people are less going with blind faith or a dogma related to this. But it doesn't seem to have diminished. This is not true. Of course, we scientifically continually run up against new frontiers. The Hubble Space Telescope is showing us more. And just when you think you understand a little bit of microscopic world, here's a new particle or something. So there's room for all there too. But I think what they're saying too is you go back to a poet or writing of days that still are awe-inspiring or make you relate to that, and everyday experiences are still happening. So I think that's kind of fascinating. And those people who think, oh well, Julian of Norwich, she just had some kind of brain event.
Yeah.
And not take it seriously. No, it's a real phenomenon that deserves attention being paid to it.
And I think, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just wondering, where does overwhelming horror fit into the concept of awe? It's almost like the opposite of awe, or and recently we've been exposed to photos and films of overwhelming horror, and from the Holocaust, and our era seems to be full with images and testimony to overwhelming horror, which in a way is awesome. I mean, in a very, very, very negative way. I mean, how does that fit in?
My sense is, and I think I might have mentioned something about this in the when I was talking about Burke's book about his philosophical inquiry into the sublime and the beautiful. So he's writing in the mid 1700s, and he emphasizes fear a whole lot more than Dr. Keltner talks about it. And it might just be that's just something that has shifted in the culture, that which I do think has to do more with understanding that science helps us understand the world more, so we don't react to the whole world with fear, or so like the Northern Lights. Renata, I was thinking about this when you were talking, that we know what the Northern Lights are now, but that doesn't change the fact
exactly
that it's still amazing. But a couple hundred years ago, people looking at the Northern Lights might have been terrified because they didn't understand. And so they're layering that fear into everything else. So my sense is that's an important feature about the history and the culture developing over time. But what's also going on at the same time would be just the overwhelming aspect of it, that war is a horrible thing and massive thing, and so just looking at it, the scale of the horror is bigger than you. So I think there's a sense in which you still might feel small in the face of it, so that's going to be awe, but it's going to be the fear and the horrible and the terrible that is the content, and so it can't have that content. That's the one we're not going to go out and try and cultivate.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of big storms that can be very destructive, and they are very awesome.
Yeah.
Now I'm thinking of a big bomb blowing off, which is equally destructive, but it is not awesome because, and I'm speaking for myself now, I feel connected with the storm. I feel part of nature. I do not and try not to feel part of the evil of men who are dropping the bombs. So there's no connection there.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. And I'd like to add about the fear, and just as you looked up the German word, I looked up the Greek translation of awe, and indeed it did include fear.
Yeah, I think all the original definitions do. Yeah, which I think, again, I think has to do with the time periods that those came in. Yeah, that's an interesting feature. I wonder. I'll have to see if I can find more on that.
Yeah, I mean, what comes to mind are the Titanic experience and Hiroshima. I mean, just unimaginable.
Yeah, and probably the unimaginable is certainly going to contribute to it. That unexplained aspect of it. Yeah, interesting. Okay. Oh, actually, I had another example of the understanding one, but it's still awesome. Have you guys seen the photo that Hubble took of they call the deep space field? And it's all of these colors and all of these dots. And someone points out to you, oh, all of those little dots, those aren't stars. Those are all galaxies. It's like, holy crap, big. and that was in a spot that was apparently blank. They thought nothing was there. Hubble look at it for a couple of weeks and collect light, and what they discover is no, it's absolutely chock full of galaxies.
Yeah.
That photo, that's I think for Joanna, that's an example. That photo is just, oh my God.
Yeah.
Culturally constructed these experiences are. I mean, before the Romantic era, mountains, which are now a source of awe, right, were considered just ugly. Deformities on the earth. And that suggests that what inspires awe may change over time. Right. I mean, so it's a universal emotion, but does it manifest differently in different cultures?
Profoundly so, and I think that the structure of awe of I encounter these vast mysteries, I feel what William James called saintly tendencies to serve. My mind is open to wonder, to figure out why this is mysterious. That's a structure you see in a lot of awe experiences across the culture, but it's radically culturally constructed, both across cultures and across historical periods.
Any examples of like a culture that finds awe in something we don't at all, or vice versa?
So in China, awe is felt very regularly for teachers. And if you ask the African American teachers, your students feel awe for you?
Not
and the people in positions of higher up in the hierarchy. We have a rather pathetic or tragic finding. In the United States, college students feel awe 9% of the time about themselves.
Oh my.
They're like, man, I got this new fellowship. You see my photo on Tinder? It's amazing. And that's individualism that's ruining awe, right? So, but it gets deeper. And this is what's fascinating about it. And it is this cultural particularity, personal particularity, and also linked to the universal. It's a great exercise you can do with, if you have friends at a gathering, you can say, tell me about an awe-inspiring experience with music, right? And someone will say, oh man, it was the Grateful Dead, someone else will say hip hop, then there's the Garth Brooks fan, and you're like, I can't believe that, you know. But somehow there's this universality to it. So embedded within it is all kinds of miraculous variation, which is wonderful. You know, it makes it fascinating.
Oh, it's great. It's great. So
what's an experience of awe in music for you?
Well, there was that Grateful Dead concert when I was in 10th grade. I have to say, it was like, it started at midnight and went into 5 in the morning.
Wow.
And there were moments of, and no drugs were involved. It's just the music.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the Grateful Dead too, and Jerry Garcia, they call it noodling, has this ability to just wander with his guitar, and they'll finish one song and then he wanders for a while noodling, and then all of a sudden they're playing a different song, and what you realize is in between, I totally lost track of myself. I have no idea what happened or what's going on in the middle of that, but I was just so lost in the noodling that self just disappeared, and there it is. Oh, it's just wow. How does he do that? How did he do that?
But isn't there an equivalent in I mean, I've never been to one of these things, but the modern music raves or whatever you call it, where there's a disc jockey, techno music, and then long hours of groups of people, huge groups, sometimes moving together.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure that drugs involved there somewhere, but without that, even it's that.
Oh yeah.
I mean, you wouldn't do that at home listening to the music. You know, it takes a group to be doing it together, hours long, and it's just fascinating to look at these young people.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And then of course that's where it's cultural. You know, which music is it that you enjoy, and so
yeah.
Yeah.
So going to Iceland and seeing the Northern Lights is an expensive form of awe.
Yeah.
Is awe equitably distributed in our society? I mean, you know, a lot of the things we think of as classic awe experiences involve going to Yosemite, leisure time, all this kind of thing.
Yeah.
So is there inequality built into awe experience?
Yeah, you know, one of the, I think, big misconceptions that I hope you leave tonight with by disabusing is awe is rare and rarefied. It's actually all around us, you know, and as in some of our research, the more people practice awe, the more they just feel it in all kinds of experiences, out in nature, out in the world. You know, what Soren Kierkegaard, the great philosopher, called the chance encounters with the significance of insignificant things. And so awe is just all around us, right? It's not rare. A second big misconception is that
do people have to be trained to see it?
Yeah, I mean, and you can train up to quiet your mind, not label things, resist analyzing, go to things that ask questions. Rachel Carson, the great environmentalist writer, has a great essay on how to teach your child to feel awe with these kind of techniques. The other big misconception is when you ask people what is awe, and often it involves like hopping on a plane, emptying the bank account, getting to the barrier reef, and in fact that's not true. You don't need resources to feel awe. You know, there's empirical work showing the more resources people have, the less awe they actually feel, right? Which is provocative. Maybe resources get in the way of awe. I'm not sure how much awe people actually feel on really expensive vacations anyway, right? They're fighting with their spouse or whatever it is. So, you know, I think one of the lessons of this book is and this is a lesson of William James and Ralph Waldo Emerson and others, is just go get it. It's right around us.
So it's about perspective as much as the content of your experience.
Yeah.
That's how you look at it.
Yeah.
That idea of not.
Okay, I think we're about to run out of time. Wouldn't you know it? Seems to keep happening. Okay, so any last thoughts anyone wants to share?
Yeah, I was
I
just
have one.
Yeah, I would say we in the Pacific Northwest are, we have this mountain down south that always is awe-inspiring.
Mhm.
And
Alex?
I would like to recommend a book that I just read because it is all about awe from very many different perspectives. It's a novel, and it
Oh,
is called Sun House
Hmm.
by David James Duncan. I think it's a relatively new book,
Yeah.
800 pages of awe. So I thought I should mention it here.
Mhm.
all righty. Thank you. There we go. Okay.
Roma wanted to say something.
Yeah.
Oh, I know we're getting out of time, but I was talking to a number of friends this week about awe and how do you experience it? And people were talking about that sense of maybe losing your sense of self. And I was saying how for me it's a very direct experience of what I'm experiencing. And I asked them what they thought about the idea of the definition, including that it makes you feel small. And people, I kind of reject that, and people were rejecting that also because that's a comparison. If you lose your sense of self, you're not even there, and it's the default mode network that makes comparisons. So it's a process, and I called it connection last week, but I'm thinking now it's more of I'm just directly experiencing this, and it knocks everything else out of my head.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, that's a
That's
good way to put it.
Yeah, which I'm guessing it becomes an interesting puzzle for the psychologist to try to disentangle, because if they're trying to measure what the default mode network is doing while it's going offline, how do you do that? And yeah, so that's an interesting idea. Yeah. I think what he would say is that if you don't have a sense of self, you necessarily get small. That it's decreased anyway. So your sense of self is decreased if you don't have it. But I think maybe that is maybe that because that just works for his experimental methodology, but maybe not work as well conceptually for some people.
Well, in his definition, the author, I thumbed through the book a little, and he does talk about that it's a sense of vastness, but that doesn't mean that I get smaller. I can look through a microscope or I can look through a telescope, but I'm still me, I'm still the same. And because something is vast doesn't mean that I have a feeling of being smaller. I think that's what people were objecting to in the group that I was talking. And it was a group of people from my art class.
Interesting.
Talking about that thing of scale too. If you were going to depict the scale of something, it's relative then to what you are, but it doesn't mean you feel small. You're just trying to show how big that is. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, and I wonder if maybe this is just an unfortunate kind of tangle of language, that what's most important is the default mode network being offline. And then it's a matter of how are you trying to describe that to people? And so he's using this language of smallness as a way of describing that. But that's not actually the thing that matters. What matters is that you took the default mode network offline for a second or two or a minute if you're lucky. Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that could be a language problem.
Yeah. Like zero, the concept of zero. I mean, is that small? It's nothing.
Yeah. And yet vast at the same time. All righty, class. Oh, go ahead, Renata.
I just wonder when people were asking the frequency of experience, I just want to say from my personal life experience, I wonder if there's some kind of an arc. You're very young. Somebody mentioned a child played with a faucet. You're nothing but awe, because this default ego doesn't exist. And then you enter this adult period, so to speak, where into analyzing, and you're also in American culture very busy, and then you kind of drift more into the openness to awe. It seems like very young and the older.
Well, age helps.
Age helps. I mean, it's one of the few things where age helps.
Yeah. Okay. That's an interesting thought. Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. All righty. I'll let you go. I'll see y'all next week.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
All out there. Oh, wait, we gotta stop the recording first.